And then you refresh here. And we'll hit this one. And then you may begin.
When the sky is like a bright canary yellow, I forget every cloud I've ever seen. So they call me a cockeyed optimist, immature and incurably green. I have heard people rant and rave and bellow that we're done and we might as well be dead. But I'm only a cockeyed optimist, and I can't get it out of my head. That song was from South Pacific. And if you hadn't already guessed, Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote it. My name is Mady Brand, and my senior thesis question was, how did Rodgers and Hammerstein revolutionize musical theater? As individuals, Rodgers and Hammerstein innovated musical theater. As partners, they revolutionized it. They wrote 9 stage musicals, 5 of which were outstanding successes: Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, and The Sound of Music. The first show they collaborated on, Oklahoma, was the first time both song and dance were used to tell the story. Oklahoma marked the beginning of the golden age of musical theater in 1943. Before the golden age, Broadway shows were primarily musical comedies, which were a different type of theatrical entertainment than today's musicals that are comedic. Even the term musical didn't exist until the golden age. The songs in musical comedies, usually featuring a star performer, and chorus lines were often at the expense of the plot. Rodgers and Hammerstein established the book musical as a standard of the musical theater industry with Oklahoma. They further revolutionized musical theater with their other collaborations. Oscar Hammerstein II was born in New York in 1895 to a theater family. He was named after his grandfather, Oscar Hammerstein I, while his father managed theaters and vaudeville houses. At Columbia University, he first met Richard Rodgers. Lyricist Oscar Hammerstein II collaborated with Jerome Kern on Showboat in 1927, which tells the story of the performers of a traveling showboat on the Mississippi River, and it examines racism. This show was the first book musical, meaning it was the first time song had been used to tell the story. Richard Rodgers was born in New York in 1902 to a passionately musical family. Every evening they would gather around the piano and sing songs from the popular operettas of the time. Composer Richard Rodgers and lyricist Lorenz Hart wrote show after show with the unmistakable stamp of the jazz age. During their partnership, Rodgers attended the Institute of Musical Art, the school that would later become Juilliard. Rodgers and Hart's 1936 show, On Your Toes, which tells the story of a dancer's journey from vaudeville to ballet, was the first time dance had been used to tell the story. Despite the success of the partnership, Hart developed a serious drinking problem. In 1942, Teresa Helburn, co-founder and co-director of the Theater Guild, came up with the idea to make a musical adaptation of Green Grow the Lilacs, a play that the Theater Guild had produced in 1931. So she approached Richard Rodgers, hoping he would write the music for the show, and he was on board. Hart was not interested in the project, and he abandoned his partnership with Rodgers for the opportunity to drink in Mexico. Hammerstein had also rediscovered Green Grow the Lilacs, so when Richard Rodgers approached him and asked him to read the script, he didn't need to read it. He was already on board. They shook hands as they set out to create the show the Theater Guild had asked for, and a new partnership was formed, Rodgers and Hammerstein. Lynn Riggs wrote the play Green Grow the Lilacs to preserve his childhood memories of growing up in Indian Territory before Oklahoma became a state. For the musical adaptation, Richard Rodgers wrote the music and Oscar Hammerstein II wrote the libretto. Perhaps the most important decision they made for this show and for their partnership was that Hammerstein wrote the lyrics before Rodgers wrote the music. So that allowed for the lyrics and the script to tell a cohesive story. For the opening song of the show, Hammerstein's lyrics were inspired by the very first stage directions in Riggs' script, which read, "It is a radiant summer morning, several years ago, the kind of morning which, enveloping the shapes of earth, men, cattle in a meadow, blades of the young corn, streams, makes them seem to exist now for the first time," which became...
There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. The corn is as high as an elephant's eye. And it looks like it's climbing clear up to the sky. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way.
Hammerstein wrote a storyline for the Dream Ballet for Agnes DeMille to choreograph. For the musical adaptation, the goal was for the audience's experience to sound, look, and feel like the Western environment in which the show takes place. When it came to casting, they chose not to cast stars as other creators of the day would have, because they preferred to let their shows take the spotlight. They didn't want people to come to see Oklahoma because a star was in it. They wanted people to come see it for the show itself. In the out-of-town tryouts, a critic dismissed the show with the review, "No legs, no tits, no chance," which really shows what type of entertainment musical comedies were. On opening night on Broadway, they watched as the audience fell in love with their show. The next morning, when they came to the theater, they were greeted with chaos as a line of ticket buyers stretched down the street and a policeman attempted to maintain order at the box office. The demand for tickets to Oklahoma soon became legendary as it became seemingly impossible to get them. With its outstanding success, Oklahoma released an original cast album, which was not standard practice for the day until Oklahoma happened. Before Oklahoma and the Golden Age, the scores of most shows on Broadway disappeared with the closing of the show. History can be given credit for some of Oklahoma's success, as it was very timely with World War II, for Agnes DeMille would explain that somehow within the show is the essence of America, of the country we were fighting for. The audience at every performance included men in uniform, as well as people who had loved ones who were off fighting in the war. Oklahoma was the first to use both song and dance in the same show. It made the use of song and dance as storytelling devices a standard of the musical theater industry, as book musicals became what creators strove to write. Of all the musicals they wrote, Carousel was their favorite. It tells the story of Billy Bigelow, a carousel barker who marries Julie Jordan. When Julie becomes pregnant, he tries to find a way to get money to pay for his child to have a good life. So he's coerced into assisting in a robbery, and he's caught. And so, to avoid arrest, he kills himself. In the afterworld, he is given the opportunity to return to Earth for one day. where he meets the daughter he never knew. Carousel was tremendously successful, and the audience was filled with soldiers returning from World War II and people who had lost their loved ones to the war. So Carousel, the way Carousel examines death, touched the audience, and it did so in a darker way than Oklahoma had. Carousel laid a stone on the path to darker musicals and strengthened what they had established with Oklahoma. Allegro tells the story of a man's life from birth to death. The purpose of this musical was to show that when you become successful, you become so caught up in the responsibilities of that success that you lose touch with that which made you successful. Allegro's out-of-town tryouts was one of the biggest train wrecks in musical theater history, and the show was a flop when it got to Broadway. In the creation of Allegro, Hammerstein proved the very point of the musical. Though Allegro was a flop, it was significant in that it was the first concept musical, a genre in which the musical is driven by concept rather than by plot. While Rodgers and Hammerstein were in the process of writing Oklahoma, Hammerstein began mentoring 12-year-old Stephen Sondheim. Sondheim would go on to continue the work of his mentor, further developing the concept musical and writing the lyrics for Gypsy, which has been regarded as the greatest American musical of all time and the most perfected example of the book musical. Just as Rodgers and Hammerstein had established the book musical as a standard of the musical theater industry, Sondheim established the concept musical as a standard. Sondheim said that I realize I'm trying to recreate Allegro all the time. Witnessing Allegro's failure inspired him to write a successful concept musical. South Pacific, set on an island during World War II, tells the story of Nellie Forbush, a nurse from Arkansas who falls in love with Emile, a French inhabitant of the island. Upon learning of his mixed-race children, Nellie, due to her prejudices, refuses his proposal of marriage. Having lost Nellie, Emile accompanies Joe Cable on a war mission, and Joe loses his life. So Nellie realizes that Emile could lose his life. So rather than remain buried in her prejudices, she starts to bond with his children. South Pacific was the first musical Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote that did not take place in the United States. Yet, it still was relevant to the American people as it dealt with World War II, which had only just come to an end. When the musical first premiered in 1949, segregation was still the reality in the United States. South Pacific was influential in that it dealt with interracial relationships and discussed racism. In addition to the cultural phenomenon of South Pacific, it was also the first musical to sell souvenir merchandise, which obviously became a standard of the industry, as you can have Hamilton t-shirts. To this day, South Pacific has won more Tony Awards than any other Broadway musical. The King and I tells the story of Anna and her son who set sail for Bangkok from England in 1862 to tutor the children of the King of Siam. This musical was the first star vehicle that Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote, and their star was Gertrude Lawrence. When The King and I opened on Broadway in 1951, it was met with outstanding success. Lawrence had played Anna for over a year when her health started deteriorating. One night during the show, she collapsed on stage and was sent to the hospital. She passed away, and the house lights of every Broadway theater dimmed for 1 minute in her honor. She was the first person to ever receive the honor of the dimming of the lights, which would become a Broadway tradition. The Sound of Music was the last of the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. Set in Austria just before World War II, it tells the story of Maria, an aspiring nun who is sent to be a governess of the house of the family Von Trapp. On November 16, 1959, The Sound of Music opened on Broadway with triumphant success. It won the Tony Award for the Best Musical. Mary Martin beat Ethel Merman for Best Actress in a Musical, and the show won in 3 other categories. While writing the show, Hammerstein's health had begun to decline, and on August 23, 1960, he passed away. Hammerstein became the second person to receive the honor of the dimming of the lights, and the first to receive the honor in which the marquees of the theaters were dimmed as opposed to the house lights. The last lyrics Hammerstein ever wrote were for Edelweiss. Rodgers and Hammerstein's partnership had come to an end with the musical, whose words bid adieu with "So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye." Recent Broadway revivals of Rodgers and Hammerstein shows include The King and I in 2015, Carousel in 2018. A reimagined revival of Oklahoma opened a few weeks ago at the Circle in the Round Theater on Broadway. Rodgers and Hammerstein revolutionized musical theater by redefining what made a musical successful. They established new standards of the musical theater industry and touched the hearts of the American people. Rodgers and Hammerstein established the telling of the story as the most important aspect of the show. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mady. We're going to move into questions, and so audience members, please feel free to jump in, and then panelists as well.
Yes, Lori?
Which one of these is your personal favorite musical that they did, and why?
I gotta say, it's a tie, actually.
It's a cop-out, Mady.
Well, The Sound of Music was the first musical I ever saw, which is important because my entire life is dedicated to musical theater now. But I really love Oklahoma, and not just because of how significant it was. Every time I've watched Oklahoma, I've just been filled with joy, and it's like all my problems seem to go away. Sage?
I wanted to ask, why do you love musicals? Why do you love theater?
I love theater because you're able to express yourself through playing other people. And singing the songs is, I think, a better form of expression than just saying words. So doing a straight play is great for expressing character, but singing the songs takes it to a new level of expression. Yes?
So, clearly, Rodgers and Hammerstein have done a lot of epic things,
Yes.
right, within the industry. But if you could water it down or narrow it down to one influential thing that transcends their careers to the current day, what is it?
It was definitely that Oklahoma established the book musical, because if you go to Broadway and see a show, most of the shows you're going to see are going to be book musicals. Some are operettas, some are concept musicals, but most of them are going to be book musicals.
And that means that it's story forward, is that what
Yeah, the songs tell the story. Yeah.
So could you say that Oklahoma was the very first, like, would you say it was too successful? Like, for what it was.
You know how successful Hamilton is and how everyone's crazy about Hamilton nowadays, and everyone's like, I need tickets to Hamilton, but you can't get them because everyone's already got the tickets? That's what Oklahoma was like.
Gotcha.
Yes?
I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit here, so feel free to just this is beyond the scope of your research, and I know that. Where do you think musicals are going next? Like, what do you think is the next big kind of innovation?
Well, there's actually an innovation that already started happening recently. In 2008, I think, a revival of Sweeney Todd was done where the cast was also the orchestra. So they played instruments on stage, which helped to tell the story, but also were part of creating the music of the show. So actors on Broadway are now worried about being able to play an instrument, so they have to be quadruple threats now instead of just triple threats, as instruments are being added into shows. That happened with a few shows since Sweeney Todd, the revival. I think the first original one was The Band's Visit, which just closed last week, which is kind of sad because it was fantastic, but.
And what are the triple threats?
Triple threat is being able to act, sing, and dance, and quadruple threat adds the being able to play an instrument.
Maddie, I have a personal question for you. If there was one role out of all of the Rodgers and Hammerstein's plays, if there's one role that you could play, which role would that be and why?
I'd want to play Maria in The Sound of Music, but I know that would never happen because I'm not the right person to play Maria. But I've just grown up with that role, and when I was little, that's the role I always dreamed of playing. Now that I'm older, I know I'm not the right person for that role, but I'd always dreamed of playing that role when I was little.
Any other questions? All right, we're going to stop it there. Thank you very much, Mady. We're going to send you out for a moment.